Man refuses to help woman in wheelchair until he sees her Medal of Honor. The city pulsed with the frenetic energy of late afternoon, a symphony of honking horns, chattering voices, and the relentless rhythm of footsteps on concrete. Amidst this urban cacophony, James navigated the crowded sidewalks with the practiced ease of a longtime city dweller. At 33, he cut a sharp figure in his tailored charcoal suit, his polished Oxfords clicking purposefully against the pavement. James's attention was wholly consumed by the smartphone in his hand, his thumb scrolling rapidly through a cascade of emails and calendar notifications. His brow furrowed slightly as he mentally rehearsed his upcoming presentation, the figures and projections dancing through his mind like a complex ballet. The promotion he'd been eyeing for months was tantalizingly close, and this meeting could be the final push he needed to secure it. As he approached a busy intersection, James barely registered the changing of the traffic light, his feet carrying him forward on autopilot. The crosswalk filled quickly with a diverse array of pedestrians, harried office workers, tourists consulting maps, and students with backpacks slung over their shoulders. In this moment, they were all merely obstacles to James, human-shaped barriers to be navigated around without a second thought. It was then that Lisa appeared at the edge of James's peripheral vision. A woman in her early 40s, Lisa sat in a wheelchair at the corner of the intersection, her face a mask of concentration as she struggled to maneuver over the uneven curb. The wheelchair's right wheel kept catching on a small lip where the ramp met the sidewalk, frustrating her efforts to join the flow of pedestrians crossing the street. Lisa's appearance was neat and professional, a crisp blouse, tailored slacks, and low heels that spoke of a woman who refused to let her disability define her style or her capabilities. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that, despite its current look of frustration, hinted at a usually cheerful disposition. As she struggled with her wheelchair, Lisa glanced around, her eyes seeking out a friendly face or a helping hand. But the bustling crowd seemed to part around her like water around a rock, their gazes sliding past her as if she were invisible. A few people noticed her predicament, their steps faltering for a moment, but the relentless pace of city life quickly swept them along. James, still engrossed in his phone, almost bumped into Lisa before his instincts kicked in, causing him to sidestep at the last moment. For a brief instant, their eyes met. Lisa's gaze held a mixture of hope and resignation, a silent plea for assistance that she was too proud to voice aloud. James registered her struggle in that fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition passing through his mind. But as quickly as the moment arose, it passed. James's thoughts immediately returned to his impending meeting, the potential promotion, the myriad tasks that awaited him at the office. He rationalized his inaction in a split second. Surely someone else would help her, someone with more time, someone whose career didn't hang in the balance of the next hour. The light changed, and James stepped off the curb, his long strides carrying him swiftly across the crosswalk. Behind him, Lisa remained stuck at the corner, her quiet struggle continuing unabated. As James reached the other side of the street, he allowed himself one brief glance back. He saw Lisa still trying to navigate the troublesome curb, her face set in a determined expression that spoke of a woman accustomed to overcoming obstacles. For a moment, James felt a twinge of guilt. It would have taken him mere seconds to help Lisa over the curb, to ensure she made it safely across the street. But the moment passed quickly, subsumed by the urgent buzz of his phone and the looming specter of his upcoming meeting. He pushed the image of Lisa out of his mind, focusing instead on mentally reviewing his presentation points. As James continued down the bustling sidewalk, weaving between slower pedestrians with the impatient energy of a man on a mission, he remained oblivious to the ripple effects of his small decision. He couldn't have known that his choice to walk away from Lisa would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge his perceptions and force him to confront aspects of himself he'd long ignored. The city continued its relentless pace around him, a living entity of concrete and steel, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on its streets. James checked his watch, quickening his step as he realized he was cutting it close. The glass and steel monolith that housed his office loomed ahead, a temple to ambition and corporate success. As he approached the building's revolving doors, James took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders and plastering on the confident smile he'd perfected over years of business meetings. He pushed thoughts of Lisa and the intersection firmly aside, compartmentalizing them in a corner of his mind, reserved for "not my problem." Little did James know that this small moment of indifference, this tiny choice to prioritize his own concerns over the needs of another, would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. As he stepped into the cool, climate-controlled lobby of his office building, James was blissfully unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down, all because of a woman in a wheelchair he chose to ignore. As James disappeared into the sleek office building, Lisa remained at the intersection, her determination unwavering despite the growing frustration etched on her face. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, highlighting the beads of sweat forming on her brow as she continued her efforts to navigate the troublesome curb. Lisa's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly, her knuckles whitening with each attempt to push herself forward. The right wheel, caught on the uneven lip where the ramp met the sidewalk, refused to budge. With each try, the chair jerked forward slightly before settling back into its original position, as if mocking her efforts. The steady stream of pedestrians continued to flow around her, creating a bubble of empty space that only served to emphasize her isolation. Some passers-by cast furtive glances her way, their eyes reflecting a mix of pity and discomfort before quickly averting their gaze. Others seemed annoyed by the obstruction she presented, huffing impatiently as they swerved around her chair. A young woman in yoga attire slowed her pace as she approached, her hand half raised as if to offer assistance. But at the last moment, she seemed to think better of it, quickening her steps and disappearing into the crowd. An elderly man with a cane paused briefly, his eyes meeting Lisa's with a flash of empathetic understanding, but his own limitations prevented him from offering more than a sympathetic nod. Through it all, Lisa maintained her composure, her chin held high despite the growing weariness in her eyes. She had faced challenges like this before. The world was not always kind to those with disabilities, but each instance still stung, a reminder of the everyday obstacles that others took for granted. Meanwhile, James had made his way to the conference room, his mind now fully engaged in the upcoming presentation. As he arranged his notes and connected his laptop to the projector, a fleeting image of Lisa flashed through his mind. For a brief moment, he paused, the memory of her struggling at the curb causing a ripple of discomfort to pass through him. But as quickly as the thought arose, James pushed it aside. He had more pressing concerns right now. The room was beginning to fill with executives and stakeholders, their polished appearances and air of importance serving to reinforce the significance of this moment. James straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and launched into his presentation with practiced confidence. Back at the intersection, Lisa had finally managed to free her wheelchair from the stubborn curb. With a final, determined push, she propelled herself onto the crosswalk, the sudden forward momentum causing her to grip her armrest tightly to maintain balance. As she made her way across the street, the light began to flash its warning, adding a sense of urgency to her already taxing journey. The physical toll of the ordeal was evident in the slight tremor of Lisa's arms and the way she paused halfway across to catch her breath. But it was the emotional impact that weighed most heavily upon her. The indifference of the crowd, the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of such a public display of vulnerability. These were the true challenges that Lisa faced daily. As she reached the other side of the street, Lisa allowed herself a moment of respite. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself and pushing away the lingering feelings of frustration and isolation. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear and determined. She had places to be, a life to live, and she refused to let this incident define her day. In the conference room, James was in his element. His presentation flowed smoothly, his carefully prepared slides and articulate explanations drawing nods of approval from the assembled executives. As he fielded questions with ease, a part of him basked in the feeling of success, certain that he was edging ever closer to that coveted promotion. Yet, even as he spoke confidently about profit margins and market expansions, a nagging sense of unease lingered at the edges of his consciousness. The image of Lisa, struggling alone at the curb, kept intruding into his thoughts at odd moments. He found himself stumbling over a word here, losing his train of thought there. Small hiccups that he quickly covered, but which left him feeling slightly off balance. As the meeting drew to a close, James shook hands with the executives, accepting their compliments with a practiced mix of humility and confidence. But as the room emptied and he began to gather his materials, the facade began to crack. The adrenaline of the presentation faded, leaving behind a growing sense of disquiet that he couldn't quite shake. James made his way back to his office, his steps lacking the purposeful energy of earlier. As he sank into his ergonomic chair, his gaze drifted to the window, taking in the city sprawled out below. From this height, the streets looked orderly and efficient, the flow of traffic and pedestrians reduced to a harmonious dance of movement. But James found he couldn't enjoy the view as he usually did. Instead, his mind kept returning to the intersection, to the moment he had chosen to walk away. He tried to focus on work, to lose himself in emails and reports, but the image of Lisa's struggle persisted, a silent rebuke to his earlier indifference. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself increasingly distracted. He caught himself staring blankly at his computer screen, his mind replaying the scene at the crosswalk. Why hadn't he stopped to help? Would it really have cost him that much time? The questions swirled in his mind, refusing to be silenced by his attempts to focus on work. Outside his office window, the sun began its descent, casting a warm golden glow over the city. The changing light seemed to signal a shift in James's perspective, illuminating aspects of himself that he had long ignored or rationalized away. As he packed up his things to leave, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Lingering pride in his successful presentation mingled with a growing sense of unease about his actions earlier in the day. Little did James know that his journey of self-reflection was only beginning. As he stepped out of the office building and into the early evening air, fate was already setting the stage for an encounter that would force him to confront his values and reconsider what truly mattered in life. The city streets, now bathed in the soft light of dusk, held the promise of redemption and the potential for profound change. The conference room hummed with the low murmur of voices as James took his place at the head of the table. The faces around him were familiar, colleagues he'd worked alongside for years, superiors whose approval he'd long sought. Under normal circumstances, this moment would have been the culmination of weeks of preparation, a chance to shine and advance his career. But as James began his presentation, he found his usual confidence oddly muted. His words flowed smoothly enough, years of practice carrying him through the carefully prepared slides and data points. Yet, even as he spoke about market trends and growth projections, a part of his mind remained stubbornly fixed on the scene he'd left behind at the crosswalk. The image of Lisa, struggling alone with her wheelchair, kept superimposing itself over the graphs and charts on the screen. As James fielded questions from the assembled executives, he found himself having to concentrate harder than usual to stay focused. A query about quarterly projections momentarily threw him off balance as his mind conjured up the look of quiet dignity on Lisa's face. He recovered quickly, but the momentary lapse left him feeling unsettled. The meeting progressed, with nods of approval and murmurs of agreement punctuating James's presentation. On the surface, it appeared to be going well. But internally, James was grappling with a growing sense of disconnect. The goals and achievements that had seemed so crucial just hours ago now felt strangely hollow. As the meeting drew to a close, James shook hands with the attendees, accepting their compliments with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The pats on the back and promises of "we'll be in touch" that would normally have filled him with anticipation now felt almost irrelevant. He gathered his materials slowly, his movements lacking their usual purposeful efficiency. Stepping out of the conference room, James made his way back to his office. The bustling corridors of the corporate floor seemed different somehow, the same sleek decor and hurried professionals, yet viewed through a lens that had been subtly but irrevocably altered. He found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before: the slight limp of the IT technician, the tired eyes of the cleaning staff working unobtrusively in the background. Settling into his chair, James turned to his computer, intending to lose himself in the familiar routine of emails and reports. But his mind refused to cooperate. Instead of focusing on the tasks at hand, he found himself repeatedly drawn back to the moment at the crosswalk. The memory played on loop in his mind, each repetition bringing new insights and uncomfortable questions. Why had he been so quick to dismiss Lisa's struggle? Would it really have cost him that much to stop and help? James tried to rationalize his actions. He had been in a hurry, focused on an important meeting. But the excuses rang hollow, even to his own ears. The truth, uncomfortable as it was that he had simply chosen not to see, not to engage with a reality that didn't align with his immediate goals. As the afternoon wore on, James found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work. He caught himself staring blankly at his screen, his mind 1,000 miles away from the spreadsheets and reports that usually commanded his attention. The numbers and projections that had seemed so vital just this morning now felt trivial in comparison to the human moment he had missed. Outside his office window, the city continued its relentless pace. From his high-rise vantage point, James watched the ebb and flow of traffic, the tiny figures of pedestrians navigating the sidewalks far below. He found himself wondering about their stories, their struggles, their moments of kindness or indifference. How many opportunities to help, to connect, had he missed in his single-minded pursuit of career success? The sunlight slanting through the window shifted as the afternoon progressed, casting long shadows across James's office. The changing light seemed to mirror the shift happening within him, illuminating aspects of himself and his choices that he had long left unexamined. The promotion he had been so eager to secure now seemed less important in the face of the simple human connection he had failed to make. As the workday drew to a close, James began to pack up his things. His movements were slow, almost reluctant, as if he were trying to delay his return to the outside world. The thought of retracing his steps, of passing by that same intersection, filled him with a mix of dread and an odd sense of hope. Part of him wished he could go back, could make a different choice. Another part feared what such a re-examination of his priorities might mean for the life he had so carefully constructed. Stepping out of the elevator into the lobby, James paused for a moment, his usual brisk pace replaced by a hesitant shuffle. The glossy marble floor reflected the warm hues of the setting sun, casting a golden glow that seemed at odds with his tumultuous state of mind. He adjusted his tie, a habitual gesture that now felt strangely performative, as if he were playing a role he no longer fully recognized. As James pushed through the revolving doors and stepped onto the sidewalk, the city's evening rush enveloped him. The air was thick with the scents of exhaust fumes and street vendor food. The elderly woman carefully navigating the uneven sidewalk. Did she need help carrying her groceries? James found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for years, small struggles and quiet dignities playing out all around him. As he approached the intersection where he'd encountered Lisa earlier, James felt his heart rate quicken. He half expected, half hoped to see her there again, to have a chance to make amends. But the corner was occupied only by impatient commuters, their faces illuminated by the glow of smartphones as they waited for the light to change. Standing at the crosswalk, James was struck by a vivid flashback of Lisa's determined face as she struggled with her wheelchair. The memory, so clear and poignant, made him wince. He imagined what might have happened if he'd stopped to help. Perhaps they would have chatted briefly, exchanged names. Maybe he would have learned a bit about her life, her challenges, her triumphs. The richness of the potential connection he'd missed weighed heavily on him. As the pedestrian signal changed and the crowd surged forward, James found himself moving against the flow. He stepped back onto the curb, letting others pass by. For a moment, he stood still, taking in the scene with new eyes. The rush of people, each absorbed in their own world, suddenly seemed both beautiful and tragic. How many connections were missed every day in this city? How many small kindnesses left unoffered? The realization hit James with the force of a physical blow. His life, so carefully constructed around career success and personal ambition, had become narrow and isolated. In his relentless pursuit of professional goals, he had lost sight of the broader tapestry of human experience that surrounded him every day. As he finally crossed the street, James felt a strange mix of emotions washing over him. There was guilt, certainly, for his earlier indifference, but there was also a growing sense of possibility, an awareness that it wasn't too late to change, to open himself up to the world around him in a new way. The rest of his walk home was a blur of introspection. James barely noticed the familiar landmarks he passed, his mind too occupied with reevaluating choices he'd made, not just today, but over years. The promotion he'd been so focused on securing now seemed less like a culmination and more like a distraction from what really mattered. As he climbed the steps to his apartment building, James felt both exhausted and oddly energized. The day had not gone as he'd expected, but perhaps that was a good thing. He had the sense that he stood on the cusp of something important, a turning point that could reshape his understanding of success and fulfillment. Unlocking his door, James stepped into the cool quiet of his apartment. The space, usually a welcome retreat from the bustle of the city, now felt strangely empty. The sleek furniture and carefully curated decor that had once filled him with a sense of achievement now seemed to echo with the hollowness of missed connections and overlooked opportunities. As he loosened his tie and sank into his favorite armchair, James's gaze fell on a framed photo on his bookshelf. It was a picture of him as a child, beaming proudly as he helped an elderly neighbor with her gardening. He couldn't remember the last time he'd really looked at that photo, really thought about the values it represented. In that moment, as the last rays of sunlight painted his living room in warm hues, James made a silent promise to himself. He would strive to be more aware, more present, more engaged with the world around him. The goals he had been pursuing so single-mindedly didn't disappear, but they shifted in his mind, taking on a new context. As night fell over the city, James sat in quiet contemplation, unaware that his journey of self-discovery was far from over. The seeds of change had been planted, but it would take another unexpected encounter to truly catalyze his transformation. Little did he know that fate was already setting the stage for a moment that would challenge his newfound resolve and offer a chance at redemption. The following day dawned with a sense of renewal. The city bathed in the soft light of early morning. James stepped out of his apartment building with a different energy than usual. His pace was slower, more deliberate, his gaze no longer fixed on his smartphone, but instead taking in the world around him. As he walked, James found himself noticing details he'd overlooked countless times before. The way the morning light caught the dew on a small patch of grass pushing through a crack in the sidewalk. The gentle smile of the barista at his regular coffee shop as she handed him his usual order. The determined look on the face of a jogger as she powered past, headphones firmly in place. Each of these small observations felt like a revelation. A window into the rich tapestry of life that had always surrounded him, but that he'd been too preoccupied to notice. The previous day's encounter with Lisa and his subsequent self-reflection had awakened something in James, a newfound awareness that both excited and unsettled him. As the day progressed, James went through his usual routines at work, but with a subtle difference. In meetings, he found himself really listening to his colleagues, picking up on the nuances of their expressions and tones. During his lunch break, instead of eating at his desk as he usually did, he ventured out to a nearby park, watching the diverse array of people enjoying the sunny day. By late afternoon, James felt both mentally exhausted and oddly invigorated. The constant awareness, the effort to stay present and engaged, was tiring, but also deeply satisfying. As he left the office, he decided to take a different route home, one that would lead him through a part of the city he rarely visited. The streets were busy with the evening rush, people hurrying home or out to meet friends. James walked at a leisurely pace, allowing himself to be carried along by the flow of pedestrians. He was so engrossed in observing the scenes around him that he almost missed the familiar figure seated outside a small cafe. It was Lisa, the woman in the wheelchair from the previous day. She was sitting at a table on the cafe's patio, her wheelchair positioned comfortably beside her. But she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man, tall, middle-aged, with a bearing that spoke of quiet strength and dignity. James's steps slowed as he approached, his heart racing with a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to hurry past, to avoid confronting the reminder of his earlier failure to help. That should make it a bit easier to maneuver. Lisa smiled up at him, her face alight with gratitude and love. Thank you, John. I don't know what I'd do without you. It was then that James noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. John was wearing a jacket adorned with several military patches, but what caught James's eye was the medal pinned proudly to his chest. Even from a distance, James recognized its significance, the Medal of Honor, the highest and most prestigious military decoration. The realization hit James like a physical blow. Not only had he ignored a woman in need, but that woman was married to a decorated war hero. The shame he'd felt yesterday redoubled, mixing with a newfound sense of awe and respect. Unable to simply walk away, James found himself drawn closer to the couple. He pretended to be interested in the cafe's menu, posted on a board nearby, while surreptitiously observing Lisa and John. John's demeanor was calm and assured, his movements speaking of a man comfortable in his own skin. Despite the prestigious medal on his chest, there was no hint of arrogance or self-importance in his manner. If anything, he carried himself with a humility that seemed at odds with the honor he'd clearly earned. Lisa, for her part, looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and deep affection. As they continued their conversation, James caught glimpses of a relationship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They spoke of everyday matters, plans for dinner, an upcoming doctor's appointment, but underlying it all was a sense of unwavering support and understanding. As James stood there, ostensibly studying the menu but really absorbed in observing the couple, he felt a profound shift in his perspective. The world he'd been so focused on, of corporate ladders and material success, suddenly seemed shallow and unfulfilling. Here, right in front of him, was a testament to true strength, to the kind of courage and commitment that really mattered. The urge to approach them, to apologize for his earlier behavior, to somehow make amends, was almost overwhelming. But James hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. As he stood there, caught in a moment of indecision, he was unaware that fate was about to intervene, offering him a chance at redemption he never could have anticipated. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the cafe patio. In that golden light, Lisa and John seemed to radiate a quiet dignity that touched everyone around them. And James, standing on the periphery of their world, felt himself on the cusp of a transformation, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, courage, and what it truly means to live a meaningful life. The gentle clink of coffee cups and the low hum of conversation from the cafe created a soothing backdrop as James lingered near Lisa and John's table. He was close enough now to catch fragments of their conversation, each word adding depth to the portrait of these two remarkable individuals. "Do you remember that young soldier? The one from Ohio," John was saying, his voice low and thoughtful. "I ran into his sister last week. She's working at the VA hospital now, inspired by her brother's service." Lisa nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "That's wonderful, John. Your influence goes far beyond what happened that day. You've touched so many lives." James found himself inching closer, drawn by the undercurrent of significance in their words. As he pretended to study a nearby poster advertising local events, his ears strained to catch more of their conversation. John leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as if looking into the past. "You know, sometimes I still wonder if I did enough, if I could have saved more of them." Lisa reached across the table, her hand covering her husband's. "John, you did more than anyone could have asked. You risked everything to save those men. The Medal of Honor doesn't begin to cover the depth of your sacrifice." The Medal of Honor. James felt a jolt of recognition. He'd been right about the significance of the medal on John's chest. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was overhearing. This unassuming man, sitting quietly in a cafe, had performed acts of valor so extraordinary that he'd been awarded the nation's highest military decoration. As John and Lisa continued their conversation, more details emerged, painting a vivid picture of John's heroic past. James learned that during a particularly harrowing mission overseas, John's unit had been ambushed. In the chaos of gunfire and explosions, Several of John's fellow soldiers had been wounded and pinned down by enemy fire. Without hesitation, John had rushed into the fray. Again and again, he'd braved a hail of bullets to drag his injured comrades to safety. Even after being wounded himself, John had continued his rescue efforts, refusing to leave anyone behind. "I can still hear the sounds sometimes," John admitted softly. "The gunfire, the shouts, the pain. But what stays with me most is the look in their eyes, the trust they had in me, the faith that I wouldn't leave them there." Lisa squeezed his hand, her voice filled with pride and love. "And you didn't leave them. You saved so many lives that day, John. You're a hero, whether you feel like one or not." John shook his head slightly, a rueful smile on his face. "I'm no hero, Lisa. I just did what anyone would have done in that situation. What I couldn't do was leave my brothers behind." As James listened, he felt a profound sense of awe and humility wash over him. The challenges he faced in his daily life, the stress of deadlines, the pressure of presentations, seemed trivial in comparison to what John had endured. Here was a man who had faced death, who had put his life on the line for others without a second thought. Yet, despite his extraordinary acts of bravery, John spoke about his experiences with a deep sense of humility. There was no boasting, no seeking of accolades. If anything, John seemed almost uncomfortable with the notion of being called a hero. Lisa, too, impressed James with her quiet strength. It was clear that she had been a pillar of support for John, helping him navigate the aftermath of his wartime experiences. Her own daily struggles with mobility seemed to pale in comparison to the emotional weight she helped her husband bear. As the conversation between John and Lisa turned to more mundane matters, plans for the weekend, a friend's upcoming birthday, James found himself profoundly moved. The easy intimacy between them, the way they supported and uplifted each other, spoke of a bond forged through shared challenges and mutual respect. James thought back to his own relationships, both personal and professional. How often had he truly put someone else's needs before his own? How many times had he risked discomfort or disadvantage to help another? The answer, he realized with a pang of shame, was far too rarely. The sun was setting now, casting a warm golden glow over the cafe patio. In this soft light, John and Lisa seemed to radiate a quiet dignity that touched everyone around them. Other patrons at nearby tables glanced their way occasionally, perhaps sensing the special quality of the couple without knowing their story. As James stood there, still pretending to study the event poster but completely absorbed in John and Lisa's world, he felt something shift inside him. The values he'd held dear for so long, career success, financial gain, social status, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of true courage and selflessness. He thought about the previous day, about how he'd ignored Lisa's struggle at the crosswalk. The memory, painful before, now felt almost unbearable. How could he have been so blind, so self-absorbed, as to ignore someone in need, especially someone who, along with her husband, had sacrificed so much for others? The urge to approach them, to apologize, to somehow make amends, grew stronger with each passing moment. Yet James hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between their world and his. How could he explain his earlier behavior? How could he express the profound impact their unintentional example had had on him? As these thoughts swirled in James's mind, he was unaware that fate was about to offer him an unexpected opportunity. The chance for redemption he'd been longing for was about to present itself, challenging him to live up to the example of courage and compassion he'd witnessed. The true test of James's newfound awareness was yet to come, promising to be a moment that would define the man he was becoming. The cafe patio was bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the tables and lending an almost ethereal quality to the scene. James stood frozen, his hand still resting on the event poster he'd been pretending to read. The conversation between Lisa and John had dwindled to a comfortable silence, the couple simply enjoying each other's company in the fading light of day. James's heart raced, his palms sweaty as he wrestled with the decision before him. The urge to approach the couple, to somehow make amends for his earlier indifference, was almost overwhelming. Yet fear held him back. Fear of their judgment, fear of confronting his own failings, fear of stepping out of the carefully constructed world he'd built for himself. As he stood there, caught in this moment of indecision, a gust of wind swept across the patio. It caught the edge of the poster he'd been pretending to study, causing it to flutter wildly. In his surprise, James lost his grip on the paper, and it sailed through the air, landing squarely on Lisa and John's table. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. James stared in horror at the poster now sitting between Lisa and John's coffee cups. The couple looked up, their eyes meeting his. There was no turning back now, no pretending he hadn't been hovering nearby. With a deep breath, James stepped forward. "I'm so sorry," he began, his voice shakier than he'd like. "I didn't mean to disturb you." John smiled warmly, picking up the poster and holding it out to James. "No harm done?" he said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength James had noticed in his earlier conversation. As James reached for the poster, his eyes met Lisa's. Recognition flickered in her gaze, and James felt a rush of shame wash over him. She remembered him from yesterday, he was sure of it. "Actually," James said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself, "I need to apologize for something else. I saw you yesterday, ma'am, struggling with your wheelchair at the crosswalk. I didn't stop to help, and I should have. I'm truly sorry." The words hung in the air, and James braced himself for their reaction. To his surprise, Lisa's expression softened, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice warm and free of judgment. "But it's okay. We all have moments when we're focused on other things. What matters is recognizing when we can do better." John nodded in agreement, his eyes studying James with a mixture of curiosity and approval. "It takes courage to admit when we've fallen short," he said. "That's not an easy thing to do." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with a deep sense of respect for the grace with which Lisa and John had received his apology. I couldn't help but overhear some of your conversation earlier," he admitted, feeling emboldened by their kindness. "I noticed your Medal of Honor, sir. I want to thank you for your service and for the incredible bravery you've shown." John's expression grew thoughtful, a hint of sadness flickering in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But the real heroes are the ones who didn't come back. I just did what anyone would have done in that situation." Lisa reached out, placing her hand over her husband's. "John always says that," she explained to James. "But trust me, what he did was extraordinary. He saved so many lives that day." James nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. The humility with which John spoke of his actions, the obvious love and support between him and Lisa, it all served to underscore how misplaced his own priorities had been. "I can't imagine what you've been through," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you, the challenges you've faced, the sacrifices you've made, it puts everything into perspective." John gestured to the empty chair at their table. "Why don't you join us for a moment?" he offered. "Sometimes sharing our stories can help us all understand each other a little better." James hesitated for a second, acutely aware of how different his world was from theirs. But the warmth in their invitation was genuine, and he found himself pulling out the chair and sitting down. Over the next hour, as the sky darkened and the cafe lights flickered on, James listened as John and Lisa shared more of their story. He learned about the long road of recovery John had faced after his injury, the way Lisa had stood by him through the nightmares and the pain. He heard about their work with veterans, support groups, their efforts to raise awareness about accessibility issues in the city. As he listened, James felt something shift inside him. The world he had been so focused on, of corporate success and material gain, seemed shallow in comparison to the depth of experience and compassion he was witnessing. Here were two people who had faced unimaginable challenges, yet met each day with grace and a determination to make a difference in the lives of others. When James finally stood to leave, he felt as though he had been granted a precious gift. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for your service, for your kindness, and for sharing your story with me. You've given me a lot to think about." John stood as well, offering his hand to James. "Thank you for listening," he said, "and for having the courage to approach us. It's not always easy to admit our mistakes, but it's how we grow." Lisa smiled up at James. "Remember," she added, "every day is a new opportunity to make a difference, even in small ways. That's how we change the world, one small act of kindness at a time." As James walked away from the cafe, he felt as though he was stepping into a new chapter of his life. The encounter with John and Lisa had shaken him to his core, challenging his perceptions and inspiring him to be better. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing ingrained habits and perspectives never is, but he was determined to try. The city streets, now lit by the warm glow of street lamps, seemed different somehow. Each passerby was no longer just a faceless stranger, but a person with their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. James found himself wondering how he could make a difference, how he could carry forward the lesson of compassion and courage he had learned today. As he made his way home, James knew that tomorrow would be the true test. Would he be able to hold on to this newfound awareness in the face of his usual routines and pressures? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the memory of John and Lisa, and the profound impact of their unintentional example, would stay with him for a long time to come. The days that followed James's encounter with Lisa and John were marked by a profound sense of change. As he moved through his usual routines, James found himself viewing the world through a new lens, one colored by the lessons of compassion, courage, and humility he had learned from the remarkable couple. His morning commute, once a blur of hurried steps and digital distractions, became an exercise in mindfulness. James made a conscious effort to look up from his phone, to really see the people around him. He noticed the tired eyes of the barista at his regular coffee shop, the strained smile of a mother juggling a toddler and a briefcase on the subway. Where once he might have brushed past without a second thought, James now found himself offering small gestures of kindness, a word of thanks, a held door, a helping hand. At work, the change in James's demeanor was subtle but noticeable. Colleagues who were used to his laser focus on deadlines and bottom lines were surprised to find him taking a more holistic approach. In meetings, he began to advocate for initiatives that balanced profit with social responsibility. He made time to mentor junior staff, sharing not just his professional knowledge, but also the newfound wisdom he had gained about the importance of empathy and perspective in leadership. The promotion he had been so fixated on still mattered to James, but it no longer consumed him. He approached his work with a sense of purpose that went beyond personal gain, seeking ways to use his position and skills to make a positive impact, however small, on the lives of others. Outside of work, James found himself drawn to new pursuits. He researched local veterans organizations, inspired by John's story to find ways to support those who had sacrificed so much for others. On weekends, he began volunteering at a community center, helping to teach basic computer skills to seniors and individuals with disabilities. Each interaction, each moment of connection, served to reinforce the lessons he had learned from Lisa and John. One crisp autumn morning, about a month after his transformative encounter, James found himself once again at the intersection where he had first seen Lisa struggling with her wheelchair. The memory of his inaction that day still stung, but it now served as a powerful reminder of how far he had come. As he waited for the light to change, James noticed an elderly man a few feet away, laden with grocery bags and looking anxiously at the crossing signal. Without hesitation, James stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently. "Would you like some help with those bags?" The old man looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling in his weathered features. "Oh, thank you, young man. That would be very kind." As James took some of the bags, easing the burden on the older gentleman, he felt a warm sense of rightness settle over him. This was what John and Lisa had been talking about, the small acts of kindness that, multiplied across a city, a country, a world, could create real change. They crossed the street together, James matching his pace to the older man's slower steps. As they reached the other side, the man turned to James with a smile. "You know," he said, "it's not often these days that someone takes the time to help a stranger. Thank you for restoring a bit of my faith in humanity today." James felt a lump form in his throat. "No, thank you," he replied. "You've given me more than you know." As he continued on his way, James reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few short weeks. The world around him was the same busy streets, the same rushing crowds, but his place in it, his understanding of his role in the grand tapestry of human experience, had shifted dramatically. He thought of John, of the extraordinary courage he had shown on the battlefield and the quiet strength he displayed every day since. He thought of Lisa, of her resilience in the face of daily challenges and her unwavering support for her husband. Their example had shown James what true heroism looked like, not grand gestures or public accolades, but a consistent commitment to living with compassion, integrity, and purpose. As he walked, James made a silent promise to himself and to the memory of that extraordinary couple. He vowed to never again be too busy or too self-absorbed to notice the struggles of those around him. He committed to striving every day to be worthy of the lessons they had inadvertently taught him, to honor their example by living a life of greater awareness and compassion. The city bustled around him, alive with the energy of countless lives intersecting and diverging. But now, instead of feeling lost in the crowd, James felt a profound sense of connection. Each person he passed was a story waiting to be understood, a potential moment of kindness waiting to happen. The weight of this awareness was heavy at times, but it was a burden James now welcomed, understanding that it was through this shared human experience that life gained its deepest meaning. As he approached his office building, James paused for a moment, looking up at the towering structure of glass and steel. Once, he had seen it as a symbol of his ambitions, a pinnacle to be climbed. Now, he saw it differently, as a platform from which he could effect positive change, however small, in the lives of those around him. With a deep breath and a sense of renewed purpose, James stepped through the revolving doors. The day ahead, with its meetings and deadlines and challenges, awaited him. But he faced it with a new perspective, a new understanding of what truly mattered. The simple act of noticing, of choosing to engage with the world around him with empathy and kindness, had become his personal mission. And as he rode the elevator up to his floor, James knew that while he might never wear a medal like John's, he could still strive to be a different kind of hero, one small act of compassion at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.